doesn't justify violence, even in criminal law, international law. Did they have a right to use violence in self-defense? The answer is certainly not, because there were peaceful means. And they knew there were peaceful means. They could simply reinstitute the ceasefire and the rockets, just as it had done before. But the U.S. and Israel preferred to attack, and given their ideological power, they could establish that as the framework for interpretation. Then comes, it continues until today. I mean, it essentially just, by now there's some relaxation of the bitter siege, but still the supplies going into Gaza are about a third of the level of what they were before the 2007 siege was instituted, barely enough to keep people alive. And I should say that in the area of the West Bank that Israel completely controls, Area C, 60% of the West Bank, in that area, living conditions are even worse than Gaza. Well, that's basically where we stand now. Going back to options, we have two. One option is moving toward the international settlement. The other realistic alternative is that the U.S. and Israel will continue doing exactly what they're doing, basically what I described in Gaza, the West Bank, and there could be some small Palestinian entity established somewhere who would certainly not be even minimal conditions for a decent survival. It would survive maybe at the, as long as the European Union is willing to pour money into it, so that around Ramallah, people can live quite well, like in restaurants, theaters, and so on, like any third world colony. Those are the real options. Now, what does that leave for us? Well, final word. There's a lot of discussion in recent years about the analogy between Israel and South Africa. And much of that discussion, I think, is quite dubious. So, for example, within Israel itself, there is discrimination, but it's not apartheid. Actually, it's much more like what we've been familiar with here for centuries. And I experienced myself, it's a little worse, but like that, and common around the world, unfortunately. Within the occupied territories, it's much worse than apartheid. It's not apartheid. Ariel Sharon described the cantons being left to the Palestinians as Bantustans, but that was unrealistic. South Africa needed the black population. That was their workforce. It's 85% of the population. That's the productive workforce. So therefore they had to take care of them. Just like slave owners had to take care of slaves. They couldn't let them die. That's their capital investment. So South Africa, in fact, provided some benefits to the Bantustans. Israel, in contrast, does not want the Palestinians. They're happy to have them go. And back in 1967, Moshe Dayan, again, was one of the more sympathetic of the leaders towards the Palestinians. He explained to the cabinet, to his associates, his proposals. He was in charge of the West Bank. He said, we have to tell the Palestinians in the West Bank that we have no solution for them. They're going to live like dogs, and those who want to leave can leave. And we'll see where that goes. That's the proposal, and that's what's being implemented. That wasn't true in South Africa. They needed the black population. So the analogy to apartheid is completely inaccurate, I think, in both areas. But it's worse than apartheid in the occupied territory. It's not as bad in Israel itself. However, there is an analogy which is significant and which isn't much discussed, but which tells us, I think, what we ought to do. Back in 1960, the South African nationalists, white South Africans, recognized that they were becoming an international pariah. A lot of opposition to apartheid was developing. There was a big massacre, there was a lot of protests, and so on. At that point, the South African foreign minister called in the American ambassador and told him, look, we know we're becoming an international pariah, and so on. But you and I both know that there's only one vote in the United Nations, yours. The rest doesn't matter, which happens to be pretty accurate. And in fact, history played out just the way he predicted. Through the 60s and the 70s, opposition to apartheid increased. There were sanctions, there were pressures, and finally the UN passed sanctions in the 1980s. Congress was passing sanctions. The U.S. government continued to support South Africa. Reagan had to evade even congressional sanctions to increase support for South Africa. Both South African violence, repression internal to the country, but also South Africa's attacks in the neighboring states, Angola and Mozambique, which were no small business. They killed over 1 million people in those two countries. The U.S. continued to support it. As late as 1988, Washington condemned the African National Congress, Mandela's ANC, condemned it as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. In fact, Mandela just was taken off the terrorist list 2 years ago. Now, for the first time, he can come to the United States without a special dispensation. So this is part of the famous war on terror. They're a terrorist group. We have to support white South Africa, no matter what the UN says, no matter what Congress says. And that continued. And by the late 80s, South Africa looked impregnable. They won everything. They were getting everything they wanted. They were very triumphant. Within the next 2 years, U.S. policy shifted. And a couple of, Mandela was let out of Robben Island. A couple of years later, apartheid collapsed. It's not pretty, not at all. In many ways, it's worse than under apartheid for much of the population. But it was nevertheless a major victory for justice to get rid of this horrendous system. And it turned on one point. What would the Godfather decide? As soon as the U.S. decided it'll join the world, apartheid collapsed. And I think that something similar holds in this case. If Washington's position shifts, if the U.S. joins the world, there is a short-term settlement, which is much better than what exists now. My own hope would be, and I think David would probably feel the same way, that if I read it correctly, that if the cycle of violence declines, if there is a formal political settlement, if the occupation ends, then other processes will begin to take place. Anyone who's ever been in that area knows that to draw a line through the area west of Jordan makes absolutely no sense. It just can't be done. And I suppose that commercial and cultural and other relations will develop, and it might move towards what, at least in my view, is a more sensible, longer-term settlement. But that's for the future. What's on the table right now is which choice are we going to make? The occupation with exactly the way I described, or the political settlement. That has been the international consensus for 35 years.